Buenos días a todos. Mi nombre es Graciela Listón.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Graciela Listón, and I work in the support areas of GeneXus. Actually, I started yesterday. I work with the markets of Mexico, Central America, and the U.S. As Gaston said in the previous presentation, and as Nicolas also said, in the Salto version, we tried to empower or to leverage on all those strong points of GeneXus, including the transactions and the for each. Up to now, the transactions allowed us to define the model of reality, and that model allowed us to define the tables. And with the transactions, we could enter data, modify them, eliminate them, but we never took care of the connection to the database or the actual sequences that GeneXus did, or that was hidden to us. So it happened that we created the transactions, and we knew from the beginning what were the data that would be in that transaction. What we normally programmed was some uploading procedure that recorded those data. But we saw that with the Salto version afterwards, we could do much more and help the users. And I'm going to present, therefore, a case. We have a transaction in which we have the human beings, male and female, and for each one of them we have a formula that will establish how many people of each gender we have. As you see, we have data that we are going to upload in this transaction divided in two. Salto has several properties, and in this transaction we get a tag called data, and this is new. We can start setting new properties, and one of them is tell it that the transaction is going to be uploaded through a data provider. Then we can establish the execution time, the moment in which the table is created. And we also establish that the data will going to be read-only. We have a gender, male or female, and that cannot be modified. It's going to be always the same in our transaction. So with this version, once we have this data provider tag, GeneXus creates the data provider under the transaction and also creates a code in order to for us to introduce the data in the table. When we see that this table has been created, then it's going to be completed with the data that we have just entered. In this case, we have fixed values that we already knew, but in other cases we are going to add more values. For example, in the case of the countries, we can create the system and establish that it's a dynamic transaction. The data are going to be entered at the time of creation, but they can be updated. They are not going to be read-only. So we have the data for each country, and the users can modify the data. And this is very useful when we take the application to the client. Some of the data have already been entered by us, and the client will find it easier to work. When we do F5 in GeneXus, we are going to have an impact diagram with new information. It's going to tell us that the table is going to be initialized after creation, and then there is an indexation program that is run. This is the program that we have initialized and in which we have introduced data. This for initialization, but with regard to the application, we have a system in which for each person and for a certain date, we introduce a weight. We are thinking of the health of the people who work for us. So at some point in time, we want to know which are the people that weigh themselves regularly. And people are active if they are the ones that wait at least once and did it once during the last month. So if we want to do certain thing with active people, what we can do is to create a dynamic transaction in which we have here a code for active people, a name, and we establish how we are going to enter the data in this transaction. We have a data provider, and we are going to introduce the information on demand and not at the time of creation, and it's going to be read-only. We use the data provider, and this is the logic that I have chosen. I am going to go over all the weights, the weight log data, and I am going to include among active people those who weight themselves only, and I take only the last month. So I can do a what each, and I have other attributes in my application. At that time, the system is going to calculate how many active people we have, the people who weight themselves during the last months. When we go to F5 in GeneXus, here we have the impact diagram, and you see what's going to happen. You will see that active person is a dynamic transaction. And here GeneXus is creating a view in the database with a logic that follows the weight of the people, so as to determine who is active. But if I change the concept of who is active, the people who weighed themselves during the last week, for example, the only thing I have to do is to change the data provider. GeneXus updates the information, and the application will continue to function because I'm working only with active people, and the dynamic transaction has been updated. We have other types of relationships, for example, union, people we need to bring together, and the typical case is the people who need to manage the movements in the accounting department, and these movements have to be related to some documents, for example, a purchase order or a bill, etc. We are going to create, therefore, a dynamic transaction under the concept of document. The documents are going to be uploaded on the basis of bills or invoices and also receipts. The data provider is true, the execution time is on demand, and with regard to the update policy, the data are going to be read-only. Once I have the documents, I can have the movements, which is what I wanted. So I can define a transaction that has certain movements, and it has the movements ID, the document type, as well as the amount of each document. This transaction can be used, and the good thing is that GeneXus, since I'm using here the document, can do the integrity control. It establishes whether it's a valid document, a receipt, an invoice, and this is something that GeneXus is going to do. I don't have to do anything in this regard. Other kind of data that we handle in our application are temporal data. For example, VAT changes during the life of our system, or else we have products that have a certain price that also changes, and we have to model these changes. We have the product ID, date, and the price of the product, that is to say, the price value on a certain date. Usually we defined a formula for the price of the product. We would look at the price during a certain period of time. But what happens if we want to define a list of prices? We take a certain date and we get all the products and their prices at that point in time. So here we define a dynamic transaction, and we say we have the product ID, the price, the date, and if you look here, this transaction has the following feature. a date has to be determined because what we have just said is that we want the price of a product or all the products on a certain date. So we have a data provider which is associated to this transaction, which goes over the whole list of prices that we had already handled, and for that date that we have just determined, maximize the information and gives me the price for the date. So here I have a record which is the product ID, the product price, and the date. So if I have a list for this transaction, if I want, I can have all of my products with my prices. I can give the list to my sellers and also to my customers, and they will know the price of my products on a given date. Every time this transaction is executed or I change the date, I can obtain, according to a parameter, the price for the products. We have other kinds of relations that we want to establish sometimes within our systems. And we are back in our health system. We had the weight of the people, but sometimes we want to know how many people weighed themselves during the day, or maybe some other information on the basis of this transaction. So I can create a dynamic transaction, and since I want to know how many people weigh themselves on a given day, I establish for the date, active day, and then a numeric value. This transaction is dynamic. I'm going to upload a data provider which goes over all of the weights list and counts the weights of the people, and therefore counts the number of people who weighed themselves during one day. And here I can do a for each. I have an initial date and a final date, and then I get the number of people who weighed themselves during that period. This is one more transaction inside GeneXus, but we can use it in any GeneXus object. Another case, still in our health system, would be the following. Up to now, we have been saying that what we want is to know the weight of people, but now we have more ideas, and we also want to know the height of the people and maybe some measurements, waist, chest, hips, etc. But we don't want to modify the system that we have been using up to now. People have been using the system, they have been entering their weight and are used to working like this. So we create a new transaction. This transaction has the person ID and then an ID that identifies the type of measurement I'm going to enter, like chest or waist, etc., and then we enter a value. Up to now, we have completed the requirements and we don't want to change what we did in the past. So this transaction is going to be dynamic, and the data provider is going to be associated to this dynamic transaction. And we are going to establish that the weight will be recorded under the previous transaction, but if some people use the new data provider, then what we have here is a new transaction, and if the ID is 1, which would be the weight, then I'm going to save this weight inside this transaction. That means that all the graphs and the information that I have for this transaction are going to record the weight that we have entered. But maybe other users want to continue entering the weight as they did before. So what we get in GeneXus is a list of new events that we didn't have up to now. We can insert, update or delete. These are different kinds of events. So once I enter the new weight in this transaction, I take it to the previous one, which has the person's general measurements. Or if I modify it or eliminate the weight, then I will do it too. That is to say that inside the transaction, we can program these events that will allow us to do many other things. If you analyze the transaction, we did not change the system we had before. And the data provider is, in the data provider, the information is entered in the same manner. So these are various scenarios for dynamic transactions. I just wanted to give you a quick overview, but there's much more that can be done. The transactions can be dynamic when you initialize the database with fixed or variable values. Then we can also use the data for temporary data, like changing VAT or price of products, and in the case of uniting bills to transaction, etc. This is another possibility, as well as for people organization. And with regard to aggregate, I showed you just one example, the number of people who weigh themselves during the day, but you can do many things, determining, for example, which are the clients that buy more, or the number of transactions per day, any data you need. And then the events, that's something new that we'll be able to program in a transaction. When the transactions are dynamic, you can insert, update, or delete. We can also use services as transactions. This is something I did not show you, but we can associate a transaction to a service, or to data, or to other services, and it goes on. There's much more to see. So I invite you to download the Salto version, read about dynamic transactions, and see how you can map your event with dynamic transactions. We have thought of many possibilities. I'm sure that you will think of many more. So welcome to the new users of these transactions, which will continue to evolve. We are going to add many more things, and of course I will be happy to answer your questions if you have any.
¿Aló? ¿Sí? ¿Cómo define GeneXus?
How does GeneXus define whether a transaction is a view or a table? Because I saw that you were creating a view. Well, depending on the way which you upload the information. Under creation, for example, there is, I'm not aware, or I don't know the exact algorithm, but I showed you the case of the gender and the case of the countries. These are going to be tables. The other case was active people, and this is going to be on demand. What you do is to execute it at a certain point, and there are going to be views, but this will depend on your configurations. In certain cases, you define something in the data provider, and GeneXus cannot show it as a view, and it's going to give you a warning. Thank you.
No, es de la Salto, una feature de la Salto.
No, this is a feature of Salto. It's going to be GeneXus' next version. I'm sorry, we can't hear the question in the booth.
Hola, dos preguntas. Una,
I have two questions. These new events, are they exclusive to dynamic associations? Yes. And when you showed the example of the weight, you upload first the weight and then the other properties. What was the data model like? The database, what does it look like after you define the first dynamic transaction? When you added measurements afterwards, it should have changed. No, these are two different transactions. They are different, the tables are going to be different, and they have different keys. So the weight would be uploaded twice? Yes. But what I didn't do was to modify the current system. I created a new Y in order not to change what I had before. I have the second alternative.
¿Para qué?
Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Las vistas son a nivel de base?
The views are at the level of database, or they are solved in the memory database? Are they going to be based on the same tables? If you have tables from different databases, how does it solve where it's going to leave the views? I wouldn't be able to tell you. We are going to allow this type of dynamic transactions. And here we have a developer that can maybe answer your question. GeneXus reorganizes everything. The views that Graciela showed you are for the main data store. If you want to consume a view that it's in another data store, you can consume it with the Java Red, and you see it as a regular table. But GeneXus always reorganizes on the basis of the main data store.
Bueno, si no hay más preguntas, bueno, muchas gracias a todos.
Well, if there are no further questions, thank you very much, and I hope you will use the new version.